Can you talk a little bit about that? Are we in fact deindustrializing when we look at our trading patterns, especially with regards to the patterns that are developing on the import side?
Yeah, well, so I mean, there the evidence is quite strong that there's a problem, but I think we must be careful in what we attribute to causing that problem. So we use a United Nations model of basic economic classification to just say, if we look at all of the imports into South Africa, how much of it is gross fixed capital formation, how much of it is finished goods, and how much of it is intermediate. And what we find from about 2018 onwards, we see the imports of finished goods rising, we see the imports of intermediate goods dropping, and it's quite a plunge, it's not a gradual drop. And a minor drop in the imports of fixed capital formation. So one way to interpret that is that we're not manufacturing as much as we used to, so we don't need as many raw materials. We're putting the manufacture elsewhere, and then we're importing the finished product. And we're under-investing in our plant and equipment, but you would expect that if you're manufacturing less. I think a very big part of the reason for that is the dual failure of Eskom, which is improving now, but nevertheless, in that period, Eskom's at its worst, our ports are falling over. And so what happens is we're putting our manufacture in a country where they have electricity, because you can't make it here. So I don't think that is that much of an outcome of policy as it is just a physical failure of the stuff that you need to manufacture and trade competitively. So the answer is yes, I do think we're deindustrializing. I don't think our industrial policy as it currently stands, and as you pointed out, as of 6 o'clock this morning, that might actually change. But our current industrial policy, I don't believe, goes anywhere to addressing that problem, because our industrial policy places such a small emphasis on competitiveness. Our industrial policy is heavily weighted towards import replacement versus export competitiveness. And so even though the words spoken very often are we have to create export industries, there is very little indication that any of our policies do anything to improve competitiveness.
My take on that has always been, in South Africa, if you look at the pattern of imports and exports as a percentage of economic activity, they do follow each other. They stick to each other. They move up and down in tandem over time. Should we be concerned about imports in South Africa?
No, so I think we shouldn't be concerned by the fact that we import. I mean, it's just a fact of life. But I think what we have to concern ourselves with is the changing composition of the basket of both what we're importing and exporting. If you look at the export trend, exports of basic goods like the rocks on ships that we send out in the form of coal or iron ore, that's an increasingly large part of our export basket. So again, a measure we would have of a successful industrial policy is that we're sending more manufactured goods out. But in fact, the very opposite is happening. So we can say that our industrial policy is a success. Minister Patel will give you examples at the level of a company or a sector, but it doesn't move beyond the micro level. We never see it manifesting beyond that. So I'll give you an example of this. We have a clothing textile master plan, which is an incredibly complicated master plan. One of the metrics we would look at is, are we making more stuff in that sector? Are we employing more people? But employment is halved in that sector from 2010 to where we are now. Now, there are companies in that sector that have won, without a shadow of a doubt. But is the sector more competitive? We set up a set of trade policies deliberately designed to stop imports from the other customs union countries. But in fact, the effect of the policy has been that we now import more clothing, for example, out of those sectors. Yeah. And there are good reasons for that, because the unintended consequences of these policies yield a bad outcome. And some of that is we correctly diagnosed the problem. We have to employ more people in South Africa, but no one denies that. But the solution to that can't be that we're going to force people to employ more people, which is much of how our industrial policy manifests. So we're not competitive against imports. And then what we do is we say, we've just got to punish the guys importing even more. So we create a handicap for the importer rather than focusing on how do we make our domestic sector more profitable. And that makes it very hard to be export competitive. So we will always have, for as long as we have minerals, we will have a mining industry because the miners have to come to where the rocks are in the ground. They don't have a choice. However, the minute you manufacture, or beneficiate if you like, which is just another synonym for manufacture, the minute you beneficiate, the only thing that having the minerals in your country make a difference to is that it helps to reduce the cost of getting the mineral to where it can be manufactured more competitively. And so, for example, if you guys read 30th of November last year, ArcelorMittal put out a notice in the media to say that they're going to consider closing down the Newcastle operation. One of their problems is they can't get the iron ore from the Northern Cape to Thunderbell Park. So we call what ArcelorMittal does beneficiation of iron ore rocks into steel. Now, if you can't get the train from the Northern Cape to Thunderbell Park, then it strikes me that we have a more fundamental problem than saying, why are we exporting all of this iron ore? The question is, if you can't beneficiate that product with a company that's been doing this for 100 years, then it's not clear to me how we're going to use beneficiation as a strategy. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to beneficiate, but we're misdiagnosing the problem. So you can't fix that problem by putting an export duty on insert whatever the mineral is, because that does nothing to make you more competitive.
So in essence, if you have to summarize that, the fact that our trading patterns are shifting is a function more of our inability to be competitive domestically with production.
Yes.
Okay. Ntando, I want to talk to you about the same concept, but on the African continent. Are you seeing countries that are improving their levels of industrialization versus others that are doing, that are going through similar things and challenges than South Africa?
Yes, we are observing that. I think the global event 2020, when we had COVID hit globally, we saw a shift in African countries that were moving more towards localization. And sounded great at the time, and it was also a response to what was happening globally, because now all of a sudden it's hard to get goods into country because shipping costs are up, and the availability of cargo ships to actually move goods is significantly less, and the different fluctuations around COVID regulation differs by country, and particularly hitting landlocked countries. So what we saw from that is that some countries went that way, and to Donald's point, realized, oh, but we don't have the efficiencies for localization. So backtrack, actually India or China, Taiwan, wherever they're sourcing from, we need to buy this stuff from you again. Some were smart in that, and they said, this and this and this, we're going to localize. We're not touching the rest. I think those countries were the winners. And we saw the same with our next big economy on the continent, Nigeria, where there was similar thinking, but the sheer inefficiencies in the port in Lagos just doesn't allow for that momentum. And there was a lot of interest also coming from UK and Chinese companies to say, we fixed this problem, let's help you with it. And the big challenge with Nigeria is that very populous, fairly sizable in terms of square kilometerage, but it's very sort of rectangular in terms of the shape. So it means that anything getting into the country, if it's not coming by the neighboring countries, by a sea is coming through Lagos. And the inefficiency just within Lagos, just going from the island to mainland. I mean, before the new light rail, it take anything between 3 to 4 hours. So now you're trying to move a big truck with 2 containers on it into mainland. So they started looking at waterways similar to what we have in Shanghai. But then again, when they got to it, is just what you have from an inefficient, the current infrastructure So you'll do the waterways, but then the container needs to move then from the ship onto the trucks, and the infrastructure was just not there. So I think that's the reality, but I think the wins are in those countries that decided we're going to go this way and stick to it. Kenya decided to double down on the agriculture and invest more in manufacturing. That is paying dividends for them, and I think that's where you see wins. Zambia, initially having issues, they've got the copper, you got the copper belt. They started saying, okay, let's look at what else, these byproducts that we're not paying attention to. There's a shift in terms of technology around the world and different input products. Some of these minerals are now becoming topicals in how they manufacture batteries, so let's look at that. Are we trying to manufacture those? No. What we're trying to do is widen the base, moving away from the concentration and reliance of the mining of copper, and that is also paying dividends for them. So I think what we're seeing in other countries is just a smarter way of looking at that. There's nothing wrong with localizing and saying we want to beneficiate or manufacture, but the reality is, and if you look at successful economies, is when you're clear on what will we manufacture versus not. And I think the whole import-export argument, that's where I think as South Africa we are missing it. It's what we import, and then being clear then what's coming in and what we've said from a policy we want to manufacture, we are seeing then in the export that it's not just the raw. If you're saying we want to manufacture to export, you're starting to see that in the numbers. So I think with other African countries where the wins are, it's where they're clear on what we're going to be good at versus what we're then going to place reliance on other countries.
But your example of Nigeria in terms of the port is very true. The way that I've always looked at intra-Africa trade is to say that the big changes in intra-Africa trade in future is likely to come from a reduction of non-tariff barriers, as opposed to bringing down import tariffs. Import tariffs are not particularly high on the continent on average in any case. But the big focus, especially mainstream media, is to say, let's focus on, and the agreements, the protocols, let's trade in goods, let's focus on the reduction over 10 years, on those 90% of the tariff lines. And I'm saying it's great to do that, it's useful to do that, but there are far more important things to do. And that is to get infrastructure in place, to get your goods to the port, or to the border post, to get it processed at the border post cheaply and fast, so that it can go through no man's land and on the other border. The best thing to do is actually to combine the two border posts into a single window, and to try and lower the barriers of trade at the border to such an extent that more things actually do flow across the border, and be less fixated on the actual level of the import duty that is payable on that good. But it seems to me that the focus is more on the tariff conversation, far less on the non-tariff conversation, which is the more difficult thing to fix.
And which gives it the horizon of, I mean, some people are quoting 30-year horizon to really realize AfCFTA. I think that's optimistic. The reality is that non-tariff barriers, I mean, you can look at South Africa. We had a great catalytic event with 2010. All of a sudden, there was a lot of money pumped into infrastructure, and we're benefiting from that. You and I can get into the Gautrain now and get to the airport within 10 to 15 minutes. So that's great, but how long did that take to get us there? And how long is it taking us to still fully realize what those plans? So that's the nature of infrastructure, but I would argue that something that could be more tactical is that the AfCFTA Secretariat just established the adjustment fund, right, which is going to compensate countries for the loss of income from going no tariff. I would argue that perhaps that fund, or wherever those tariff collection would go, there should be a portion of it, and some that comes from the African Union or any sort of entity or organization that's really geared towards realizing this free trade area, that is then identifying strategic non-tariff barriers to say there'll be this investment into it because the trade going into Nigeria is that key. The trade going into Ghana is that key. The infrastructure from Durban, from Walvis Bay into Zambia and all the way to Congo and East Africa is that important. So we're going to make sure that there's a very good road system that's connecting through those countries. That for me would be something that says that is a 30-year horizon, and that's practically possible. So I think that's really what we're underestimating the impact is, to really see the momentum towards the free trade area, is those non-tariff barriers.